Okay, here we go. Uh, Welcome. We're in the fifth and last part of this series. It's, as I said before, it's too short, but what can you do? I didn't realize how big a subject this was. Um, so tonight is the fifth of the lecture series. As you can see, the modern era, as I call it, in Baltimore, Jewry, 1970 to 2020. No, there's the next 50 years. And this is sponsored, as you see, by the Shuchman, so I see back in the hall, in memory of the grocery store. How many people remember Shuchman's grocery store? I see a few people, I see a few names saying, okay, well, you don't count. No, relatives excluded, Anyhow, but the truth of the matter is that we're going to be talking about, we'll probably step on people's feet tonight. That's okay. I want to, once again, as always, thank the Shul, as we ought to, for hosting us, and the Shuchman family tonight for sponsoring, and the tech team for putting everything together tonight very neatly. Thank you very much. And let's get down to business. Now we come to the last half century, which many of us know from memory. But tonight I want to analyze it not from the point of view of memory, but from the point of view of history, which is different. History consists of context and perspective. There are many academic journals whose title is History versus Memory. Okay, it's an interesting subject, right? For example, if I ask you, tell me about your grandparents, you remember a few things, but then when you actually look it up in the records, it's not the way you remembered it, because your memory plays tricks on you sometimes. Things like that, okay? Here's a better one. Oh, I used to visit my aunt's house. It was so big, and now I come back later on, right? See, memory versus history. Remember, the perfect is the enemy of the good. I want to focus tonight on sweeping trends in Baltimore Jews and Judaisms, not on politics, economics, and other things, okay? Although 1970 certainly is a starting point in terms of significant changes in politics, and especially demographics, and Baltimore Jewish geography. Think about this. In 1960, Forest Park was all Jewish. Not by 1970. Lower Park Heights was heavily Jewish. Not by 1970. For that matter, Edmondson Village was all white Christian. Not by 1970. You see? So thank you very much, Blockbusters, all these mamzerim over there. This is a very interesting and disturbing book by a reporter for The Sun, who is very liberal, by the way, and talked about the history of blockbusting in Baltimore. And you'll see a lot of names in there, blockbusters you thought were nice people. It turns out that they weren't, okay? I'll just mention Meyerhoff because it's very prominent. And some people don't know him. In fact, he might have been one of the first ones. Built his house in Roland Park, and he discovered long ago, if you just charge for regular house, it's $5,000. If you say no Jews allowed, you could charge $10,000. You see? So there's all kind of things like that. And I don't need to tell you, the blockbusters went on a roll. East Baltimore, and then uptown, and then Alcontrolli Terrace, and Lower Park Heights, and so forth, and Forest Park. We know this, okay? In terms of the geography of Jewish schools, in 1960, TA, Ner Israel, and Beis Yaakov were in certain locations. The TA was in Cottage Avenue, Lower Park Heights. Ner Israel was in Garrison Boulevard, as you know. Beis Yaakov was, what do you call that, Green Spring, next to Sinai Hospital? Okay, yeah, whatever the term is. By 1970, well, let me put it this way. By 1970, TA and Ner Israel were in different places. And Beis Yaakov the handwriting was on the wall. They bought the new place in the 70s and moved there. I don't know exactly which years. I had an argument with my wife. I said, you graduated in the new school. She said, no, I didn't. But in the mid-70s. So my point is like this, that there are significant non-Jewish, Judaic changes that sweep the city of Baltimore. It was in the 1970s that Northern Parkway became the border. Okay? Before that, I remember Belvedere and Cold Spring Lane and so forth. Okay? Because it was still the old Baltimore that we spoke about last week with its horror of too frum. Therefore, no TA could build where Northwest High School is today. I was supposed to be TA. TA bought the land. They bought the option on the land. But the neighborhood, which was all Jewish, said no way. So instead, they got a public school, which lasted as a Jewish public school for about 3-4 years. And then it wasn't, okay? But they had no regrets. They simply moved away. So that's the old Baltimore, okay? Now, one of the big stories of post-1970, of the last 50 years, is the failure of the blockbusters to destroy Upper Park Heights. I mean, they were on a roll. What stopped them? There was a routine. You buy one house, you fill full of all kinds of undesirable people, then everybody panics, they run away, and so forth and so on. So how come it didn't work in Upper Park Heights, where we live? The answer, as we all know, is something the blockbusters were not planning on. Nobody was. Namely, the growth and consolidation of the right-wing Orthodox community, which coincided with the 1970s and afterwards, and the determination of that community to make a stand and not move for the most part. And all these guys didn't know what the blockbusters didn't know what to do with that. This was due to the educational infrastructure that had been created in the previous half century, where now you have the payros. It resulted in the creation, and now I'm talking about the last 50 years, it was in the creation of a new Baltimore community of unprecedented nature. It really was the big Jewish story of 1970 to 2020, and it's a story about a move to the right. Now, before you show anything here, somebody sent me once a picture. I don't know if anybody remembers this. There was an Israel parade here in 1969. It's before 1970. It was 21 years of Israel, and Yitzhak Rabin, who was the ambassador, came over here, and it was a Jewish community parade from the JCC to Northwestern High School, which was a Jewish public school, okay? And everybody participated, including TA, Pirchei, Beis Yaakov, on a Yom HaAtzmaut parade, waving Israel flags. Now, what are the chances that's going to happen? Now, look at, you don't believe me, take a look at this. I just excerpted bits of it. There should be, now comes, this is nothing. Here it should be TA or something like that, Sunny. And wait a second. Here is Pirchei, Yaguda. Okay. This is Salute to Israel parade, Park Heights Avenue. And here's, I think, TA, something like this. And I think that's Mendy Friedman. And wait, we're not done. Here's Beis Yaakov, I think. Yeah, there's Beis Yaakov. And wait a minute, there's Rabbi Steinberg walking with them. All right? That's Rabbi Steinberg. Okay? I'm talking about Baltimore, Maryland. All right? And then come, and that's it. And then there's the ambassador Rabin with the machers and so forth. That's not going to happen today. All right? Now, that's before 1970. That's my point. Once the unique, to what happened? There's all unplanned. In the retrospect, as I said last week, it coheres. Once the unique situation of Ner Israel, which had college, this system was in place, young couples began settling here. Again, in an unplanned fashion, as in last week's lecture. And the Ner Israel Kollel played a major role in this. Now, Kollel itself, which means you stay in learning even after you're married for a while, itself didn't start in a big way until the 1960s. And once it became the fashion, then even if you're from another town, your first years in married life are going to be in Baltimore because you're learning in Ner Israel. So it's a young couple, they're going to get an apartment in Park Heights somewhere, you see? Once you're here as a married couple, now you might be from LA and your wife might be from St. Louis, but you went to Ner Israel and you're going there for the kollel, and so you're going to spend the first year, 2, 3, whatever, living in Baltimore, Maryland, and Park Heights. Once you're here, you get used to Baltimore, and very often you choose to settle here, which means the community grows as an unexpected benefit of the Kollel. Okay? Turns into a virtuous circle. Once enough couples settle and raise families, there develops a critical mass, a constituency for Haredi and not modern Orthodox synagogues. After 1970, can't think offhand of any shul that started in Baltimore, Maryland, which was modern Orthodox. On the other hand, I can think of many that are to the right. Okay? Suburban was there beforehand. What are you talking? You know that, Rabbi Gavantman. Wait, come on. You know that. He says, right? It's a consumer choice. Okay? Since the 70s, right? Since the 70s, or let me put it this way, the 70s see in Baltimore, the first American-born right-wing synagogues arise here. I'll say it again. It's not the Shomer Mishmeres. It's not some shul from refugees or immigrants or something like that. It's American-born right-wing synagogues in Baltimore. This didn't happen before. And I'm talking about substantial shuls and not small minions. I mean like Shomri and the Aguda. Different forms of right-wing, perhaps, but nevertheless, right-wing, particularly by the standards of a generation before, of the mid-20th century. In other words, no microphone, no this, that mechitza, all the rest of it. As you know, right-wing is a continuum, a spectrum. So maybe it has to do with rejecting a microphone. Maybe it has to do with being anti-Zionist. It could be all kind of different things. They're all not all the same. At the same time, the 70s, modern Orthodox, in the Baltimore sense, starts to age and to eventually disappear. All those synagogues of yesteryear are gone. In the 70s, they weren't gone, they were aging, okay? But afterwards, in the 80s and the 90s, whenever, after, they disappear. You know that, and I know that. You see, the main argument for modern Orthodox used to be, we have to attract the youth, okay? That was always the argument. We have to attract the youth. But by the 70s, it was clear that modern Orthodoxy was not doing that. The kids who went off to college weren't interested in modern Orthodox. You see, the 60s happened, okay? And the 70s was not a return to the 50s. I mean, gas was not going to be 20 cents a gallon anymore. American culture had moved on. And the old classic, what I call Eisenhower religion of the 50s, had seen its day. And if you want to go that way, modern Orthodox can't really compete with conservative if that's what you're interested in. There you can drive and park and this and that and the other. You can do anything. If there was interest in religion in the United States of America in the 1970s, it would be more fundamentalist. This was an America-wide trend. I think everybody will remember, more or less, that Jewry Falwell and all these guys, that popped up in the 70s. You didn't hear about this beforehand. Okay, I'm not saying they weren't there, but you didn't hear about beforehand. And by the way, that Jewry Falwell was the best friend of Menachem Begin, as you can see over here. In other words, you and I know, it really starts from the 70s, the Christian Zionist influence in American politics. So that Donald Trump will say, I didn't move the embassy to Jerusalem because of the Jews, right? He said, I did it because I got 1 million telegrams from the Christians. You understand? We all saw that. The zeitgeist was against the old regular bourgeois, what I call Eisenhower religion, as George Bush called it, God's frozen people. Well, the Episcopalian Church and the Lutheran Church and all these things where everything's very, dignified and decorum and somebody else does the service for you and all the rest of it. The young people left that in droves among the non-Jews as well as among the Jews. So the new Orthodox shuls would reflect this national trend of fundamentalism among the young. And their rise would lead to further dynamics, particularly in Baltimore and Upper Park Heights. In other words, the Aguda under Rabbi Heinemann, which starts in the 1970s. And that itself leads to the development of other aspects of a new community. I mean, the Starkey, the Eruv itself draws in immigrants from other towns, emptying out all across America. Because people say, I can live in Baltimore, I can go places on Shabbos. Okay? After 1970 or so, it is synagogues like Shomrei, not the modern Orthodox synagogues, which is the wave of the future of the young. The transformation of Green Spring, where we're sitting right now, is part of this story, is it not? Sherman was maybe to the left, Aguda was to the right of Ner Tamid, you see? And so we all know these trends. But I'm trying to get across, it's pretty recent. It took place in the last 50 years, okay? Now, the yeshivish trend will transform and will save Sheretz Israel, right? It's all part of the new post-1970s reality. I know Sheretz Israel had their banquet last night. That's what reminded me. I was out of town. Sheretz Israel is an interesting story itself post-1970 because the shul has gone through 4 phases, I would say. First was the original synagogue, as we saw, was the German Orthodox in the 19th century from the German invasion. Yeah, it was famous for Shomer Shabbos, but there was no chinuch, as I told you, no real education, as we've seen. The result was, I'm talking about the Sheretz Israel now, the result was that after the second generation or so, the kids went to public school, the orthodoxy attenuated for so many families, and most of the original families, I went to the Adler wedding yesterday. I was sitting with Nathan Adler going through all their names. Most of the original families, their descendants are not religious anymore. Okay? Rabbi Schaffer, who was the rabbi there for 40 years, he was not dynamic. Otherwise, things that might have turned out very different. He was a nice rabbi, and he was a fine person and all that. He didn't do anything. He wasn't the same cerebral Hirsch. You understand? And what they needed, so to speak, was a dynamic person. The second phase was, as we know, Rabbi Schwab phase. The shul had basically started to empty out from the first generation, but was replenished with all these German refugees that showed up from the war. The late 30s, early 40s, right, from the war. That's the Glen Avenue of my youth and yours. This set of laymen, under the leadership of Rabbi Schwab, who was more dynamic, okay, they played a more active role in the erection of the educational infrastructure. Notice in the TA and the Beis Yaakov and all that's in their Israel and so forth, and they filled up the shul in their day. But we all know, by the get to the 70s, let's say, by the time Rabbi Mendel Feldman, the third phase, the neighborhood was changing. The young were moving away to Green Spring and places like that. The people in the neighborhood were not German. They were not into the Yekishe stuff, and attendance declined, despite the fact that so many young couples were settling in Park Heights. We know this. In the fourth phase, what happened? The shul reformed. In other words, it went off the German standard, it went yeshivish, and now it thrives. Okay? So in other words, it did what it did to attract the young. Now, that's a very strange story. This doesn't happen, changing to attract the young, but in a different way, not to the left, but to the right. And that's what I mean when I say Baltimore's kind of unique. I can't think of anywhere else this happened in the USA. Now, back to our story. Since Ner Israel had college, and it so happens that the Social Security Administration is located in Baltimore, Maryland, a ton of Social Security and other government employees will settle here, which increases, you can go to Washington, as people do, and they commute, which increases the critical mass and leads to its own further developments. Because once you get it started big enough, then you get the acme of a large Jewish community as restaurants. Okay? And TI. You get not only TA, you get TI, right? Now, in its Litvish iteration, therein lies a tale. Let's go to the next one. This is the old Sheretz Plata that he made a TI. The old Sheretz Plata. That's Rabbi Sternhell who started it. That's Rabbi Hertzberg who helped him start it, who enabled him to start it, and some of the Balapatim. I recognize Margaretin. And maybe these are your brothers and sisters. Brothers. Anyway, wait a second. The old Sheretz Plata was a small place for Yiddish and sort of like a Hasidic cheder, let's put it that way. And in my time, the kids went in the afternoon to TA. So in the morning, they learned a block or two away in their own school. In the afternoon for English, they came to TA. That's the way it was that's the old one, okay? In the 70s, in other words, what I just described was the 50s and the 60s. In the 70s, which is this change era, because of disagreements with TA, what happened to this Hasidic cheder? It was Lithuanianized and tremendously expanded, as we know. It was taken over by Yeshiva Lane, let's put it that way. And as far as I'm aware, that's the only case I know in history of a Hasidic school being taken over by Besnagdim. I never heard of that before. But this is Baltimore. All kind of things are possible. Okay? Now, but it wouldn't happen again. I can't think of any other Hasidic cheder that's going to go, in a different direction. But anyway, the point is, the rise of TI as a big school created a new reality in terms of non-TA type of chinuch, if that's what you want. It's a touch of Lakewood, shall we say. After 1970, everything I'm talking about, see, it's all in the last half century. Again, this will attract a certain element and an additional demographic element. There are people that want to come to Baltimore because they want their kids to have a TI education, you see? Now, in other words, what I'm describing is a new right-wing American kahila, different from the old. This is nothing like the old Baltimore that I was describing in my previous speeches, okay? Think, for example, of the old Vada Kashras versus the Star K. Right? How many butchers, for example, do you have in the old Baltimore who cheated? We won't name names. Now, I'm just saying. Now, I say Vada Kashras in what I always call the faux kahila sense. It's very interesting, and I've spoken about this before. In Europe, you had a real kahila, which means a legal organization that ran all the affairs of the Jewish community. Legal in the sense that it's a corporation, it's recognized by the government. And the way Jews in Europe usually ran the show was all the Jewish stuff is run by that central body. So the kahila runs the schools and runs the kashrus if they care to, and the cemetery and the synagogues and whatever else, okay? In America, you can't have that. We got separation of church and state. So all you can do, and in addition to that, I mean, theoretically you could have it, but it's never going to happen. The way theoretically you could have it is if you went to every Jew, or the great majority of Jews in Baltimore, for example, or Cleveland or any other town, and you said, guess what, we want you to join this organization. The dues are $500 a year, and you get to vote who's on the board of directors and all this other kind of stuff. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen, okay? Let alone once they get it, who knows what they're doing with the money. So instead, what's happened in America, now I'm speaking about Baltimore, but it's not only Baltimore, was people just create their own institutions and present them to the public and say, use them. And if you use them, they kind of have a kahila type aspect to them, even though they're not responsible to anybody except themselves. So the Vada Kashras today, Starkey, is a private institution with its own board of directors, and you can't see their books. Same thing with TA, same thing with Beis Yaakov, same thing with Ner Israel, same thing with the Erev, same thing with the mikvah, and so on and so forth, right? You don't want to use the Erev, don't use the Erev. You want to use the Erev, use the Erev, you see? But it's not your business how we run it. Same thing with the mikvah. You want to use the mikvah, use the mikvah. You don't want to use the mikvah, don't use the mikvah. But you're not telling us what to do, and so forth. So this is the American model that's risen up. That communities just form, institutions just form. And listen, the Associated does the same thing. They got something called the JCC. You want to use it, use it. You don't want to use it, don't use it. But don't tell us, don't look for how we spend the money in the JCC. You see? And Levendale and everybody. You see? That's the American way. There's a whole cluster of private institutions, each one of which keeps Shabbos for itself and keeps its own books. And either you want to use them, use them. You don't want to use them, gesundheit hate. And so that's what happened in Baltimore, Maryland. For example, we have something called the Vada Kashra, the Star K. It's not officially elected by anybody. It's not appointed by anybody. You want to trust them, trust them. You don't want to trust them, don't trust them. You see? Remember, for the most part, this community, and this is just interesting, this community is, one second. Yeah. This community in 1970 to 2020 is not Hasidic. The Hasidim come later towards the end of this period, okay? Give these developments that I'm talking about 2 or 3 decades. So it's the 70s, 80s, the 90s, let's say, something like that. And you have a ton of kids here who are receiving a hermetic education totally within the Jewish frum setting, TA, TI, Beis Yaakov, Ner Israel, whatever you want. In other words, zero public school. And most of them are remaining in the fold. And you have, as a result, dynamic from Baltimore, which had never previously existed, as you saw in this series. It was now closer to the title of the Jerusalem of America than had been 100 years before. Who are the winners? Right-wing Orthodox. Who are the losers? The modern Orthodox, in both senses of the term. Now, I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just saying what happened. The old modern Orthodox just died out. Remember the Beth Jacob? Okay? It's a memory, you see? And also, by the way, the new modern Orthodox who moved here or developed here because Yeshiva at Rambam didn't work. They tried. It was too much money. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean there won't be another Yeshiva at Rambam in the future. Who knows? It's quite possible. But I know in the period I'm talking about, 1970 to 2020, it did not work. Okay? These trends developed their own momentum because the faux kahila that I'm talking about, which again looks like a kahila, even though it isn't the old model, it kind of generates from the bottom up a whole host of groups and organizations to help the public. This is all post-1970. Shomrim, Hatzolah, Misaskim, Avos Yisrael, Bikur Cholim, and so forth. Right? So again, it's the same thing. People got together. It's not the rabbi. It's not top down. It's bottom up. And somebody said, we got to do a Hatzolah here. Right? Or somebody said, we got to do a Shomrim here. Or somebody said, we got to do a Bikur Cholim here. Or whatever. And maybe they'll get the approval later of the rabbis once it's already up and running. Yes or no. But who made these? It wasn't that the community got together and had a big meeting. It's as a result of this meeting, we're going to set this and this up. Because that'll never happen. So instead, you and I and him and her got together and said, we're just starting this. And you raise the money however you raise the money. If you don't, you don't, and it doesn't happen. But if you do, then you got some kind of organization. And if you look at Misaskim just off the top of my head, somebody needs to ship a house. I mean, they're there. You don't have to use them, but people do. Hatzolah, right? Shomrim. Obviously, Yisrael if you need it, and so forth and so on. So this is all result of what I would call the synergy that comes together from all these schools coming together, the graduates coming, settling down here, and creating a new dynamic. Let me even say a word about Kiruv, which didn't happen until the 60s. But then it happened. This is, I think, in this shul. I imagine there's a Herman here. Isn't that Herman? Yeah, right? And I can see some of the people there. And what do you call it? I think that's in this shul. And Dan says, why? It's a game changer. But it really starts a little before the 70s and the 60s, okay? And what are you talking about over here? Kids primarily from public schools, not entirely, but primarily from public schools, who are going in a direction that wasn't available even in the 40s and the 50s, in the 30s and 40s. It wasn't even available, okay? It's an interesting story. Let's go to the next one. Rabbi Taub Jr. told me that, talk about Rabbi Rice, who was in Baltimore in 1800s. And one of his descendants, who many people know, apparently became religious, I think in the late 50s or something like this. And he became very close with Rabbi Taub Sr. But there was no such thing as a Kiruv organization or anything. There's no way to receive someone like that in the Baltimore community. So he said, I'm sending you to Chabad. That's how the guy became a Lubavitcher, because they already had in the 50s a network for bringing in what we today would call Baal Tshuvas. You understand? So the great-great-great-great-grandson, the descendants of a German rabbi, is now Lubavitchers. For that reason. Now, had this story happened in the 70s or the 80s, I bet you the outcome would be different. You see? So it depends when and where. That's what history is all about. All this changes after 1970. As we know, Baltimore, in addition to all the groups I just described, the ones who move here for the Arab, the ones who are moving here because of the Kollel, the ones who are moving here for, I don't know, this, that, and the other, because of TI. You have a lot of people who, locally and from elsewhere, who are Bali Chupa move here. That's a fact. So these are all constituencies of the new reality. Some are born here, many are not born here. Okay? They move here. Again, this was new in Baltimore. And all during this time, Chabad is doing its thing, right? They're doing their thing. So they had So what am I doing? I'm telling you the cholent. There's a little bit of meat, a little bit of barley, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and some salt and pepper. One is called this group, one is called that group. Nobody plans this. It's not centrally organized, but it does happen. That's my point. It does happen. And it's always to the right. I mean, things changed. When I was a little kid, basically NCSY suppressed the B'nai Akiva. That's what happened. One was more to the left, shall we say. One's more to the right. And if you're looking for a youth group and socialize all the rest of it, that's the big story. And I'm not done. Maybe you've heard of the Iranians, right? Who show up here. Wait a minute. And the Iranians, in the great, great majority, if not all of them, join right-wing orthodoxy in Baltimore. That's what they do. Okay? That's what they do. The Russians not. The Ruskies who move here in the 70s, 80s, 90s, not. Okay? But the Iranians, yes. So it's interesting how these things work. Obviously, all these increase the attractiveness of moving and settling here, and Baltimore emerges in this half century that I'm talking about, in our lifetime, as second only to Lakewood and Muncie as out-of-town communities. Whenever I go on the road for many years now, if I go, speaking of Scotland residents, go to this city and that city, and they're very nice communities sometimes, and they're very pretty too, and it's a very nice thing. I say, what's the story over here? Even Chicago, right? And they say, oh, it's terrible, Rabbi Katz, what's wrong? He said, all the young people, where are your kids? Oh, they moved away. Where are they all moving to? Lakewood, Muncie, Baltimore. Right? It's terrible. And they're sucking it out of here. And as a result, this community can't survive, and this community can't survive, and all the rest of it. Okay. Because those communities didn't have the kind of history that I'm describing over here, where all these things kind of came together, some planned, some not planned, some, good, some not good. But this is what happened. And listen, you can't tell me that it's due to the enlightened growth of Baltimore City. I can't say the mayors we've had, Chevron, are the greatest mayors in the history of Baltimore. I mean, this is The Wire, the TV shows and all the rest of it. This city is in terrible shape. So all this is happening in spite of that, which it makes the phenomenon more interesting. You see? Now, mind you, the Jews of Baltimore City, the ones who live in the city, are a tax-paying element who don't use the public schools. So the city should cherish them. I've had this pet idea for years and nothing ever happened of it. And I told it to O'Malley when he was the mayor and all. I didn't give him any time. We have in Baltimore the Harry Weinberg Fund, which is sitting on zillions. Watch this. If I were the mayor of Baltimore, whoever it is, but whoever he or she is, watch this. Talk to Harry Weinberg people and say, if you're Jewish and you move to Baltimore City, not the county, we, the Harry Weinberg, will cover your day school tuition. They could handle that. Now hold on for a second. What would happen to Baltimore City? 1 million tax-paying people would move here. I mean, there wouldn't be a house north of Northern Parkway and maybe Belvedere for all I know. You understand? Because the tuition is killing people. Now, it's not using government money. So there's no problem with church and state. All the people who are worried about, constitutional issues wouldn't be an issue. But he just blew it off, So there must be something wrong with what I'm saying, because it makes very good sense to me, okay? The city would be the win-win, because you get a whole flight of people in the city who are not using the schools, but are paying for the schools. So who would be the beneficiary? Baltimore City public school children. They can increase funding, and they're using the resources. Oh well, nobody asked me how to run the world. These developments create a new reality vis-a-vis the associated, right? Because based on what I'm talking about, the frum element, especially the right-wing element, starts increasing. It's a big minority. So we had this discussion the other day. Baltimore has, I got to tell you a story. Last week I mentioned, I had a whole group of Satmar Hasidim come to my house. This older fellow and a bunch of young people with him. Why? They were starting a new organization, or this guy is. It's a do-gooder organization. He's from Williamsburg, in New York, and it's to help almonas and grushes, single women who are stuck on their own, either divorcees or widows, and help them pay extra food for Shabbos. So let's say you give every family, I think something like $80. And it's an organized thing. Apparently they do it in New York, and they want to bring it to Baltimore, and so on and so forth. And he wanted me to help him. It's this and that and the other. Fine. He has a nice letter from Rabbi Heinemann, and so forth. And we're talking over there, this all in Yiddish. And he said, I never was in Baltimore before. There's the mall, So I tell him, I said, Baltimore is the biggest and most important Jewish community nobody ever heard about. So he said, what are you talking about? Wie viel Juden sein da? How many Jews are here? I said, how many do you think? 3,000, right? I said, how big is the Frum community? 200. I said, what would I tell you? It's 100,000. And I said, it's like 30,000 religious Jews over here. Dr. Miller tells me I'm wrong. It's 20,000. Let's split the difference, 25,000. That's a big minority, right? That's more than, Baltimore doesn't quite have 100,000. So it's more than a quarter. And in my opinion, numbers are undercounted. I think it's more, but I'll spot you and say a quarter of the community is Shomer Shabbos. That's a big minority. That's not something that the Associated can just blow off and say, some little fringe group over here. You see? That was not the case before 1970. Herman, I don't know if he's here or not, he gave me a sheaf of papers from the old TA. Yeah, there he is. From the old TA, I just didn't have time to integrate here because I was out of town yesterday. Oh my goodness, are they talking down to the TA, Meyerhoff and these other people? We're not going to give you any money. And the Jewish day schools, Beis Yaakov, were always hand to mouth, correct? Today's a little different because money has hit the Frum community. But that's, I would say, post-2020. But in the old days, it wasn't like that. It was always hand to mouth. Teachers didn't get paid and so forth. And the Associated gave them a long nose look down the road. Can't do that after 1970. You're saying can't do it by the 80s and the 90s. It's too many people in Baltimore. The old condescension, that model doesn't work. It doesn't reflect the new reality. You understand? I'll tell you another story. A couple years ago, this was with me and Eddie Hoffman. He had met in Goldberg's Bagels. This is 10 years ago, more. And because I wanted the Associated to get into the thing that I was doing the talks on Saturday night. And he tells me, he said, I called in all the rabbis from the Reform and Conservative, and I gave them help. This is Mark Terrell. Why? They're not doing enough to bring people into the synagogues. Bethel, Chezek Emunah, Har Sinai, and so forth. I said, what do you care? The Associated is not with that. He said, where are we supposed to get our next givers? You understand? So he's looking from his point of view, which he's entitled to. I'm just telling you, that's the mentality over there. So now you're looking at a situation where the old condescension doesn't work. Now, they're not going to make day school free, which is what they should do. That's not going to happen. If the Associated would undertake, and now they do help them more, but nowhere near what needs to be done, you wouldn't have the problem of government funding because there is enough money in the Jewish community, the broad Jewish community, to pay for all schools. The truth of the matter is, from a point of view of enlightenment, a Jewish education should be free for every kid in this country who wants it. Okay? It should be a right. Because how do Jewish people supposed to survive? Now, you don't have to do it, but if you want to. But it's not like that. And the tuition is killing everybody. Right? Somebody told me he's paying $35,000 a year and this and the other. Mazik used a miser. This is unsustainable. Okay? So what's the plan? Now, the Associated isn't there yet. On the other hand, I doubt anymore if they're going to have banquets and ZOA dinners, which are treif, as they used to have. It's a new reality. You want to have givers. Some of the givers are going to be coming from the Orthodox community. I was at something not long ago. Maybe it was IDF or something like that. I would say a third or a quarter or a third of the people over there had yarmulkes. Those are members of this community. And so it's going to reflect it. And everything I described about the new and unprecedented community intensified in the second 25 years. Notice this all started, let's say, 1970 to 1995. But it intensified in 1995 to 2020. Okay? For example, in the second half of this era, there's an explosion of schools and chinuch, almost all of them to the right. So I talked about the fact that historically Baltimore can never get its act together, just like anybody else, and get any kind of decent Jewish schooling over here, right? And now there's an explosion of schools. Schlangers, the Chabad Yeshiva, which is a big place, many high schools, many colleges. I can't keep track of them, right? So I saw this somewhere in a paper. There's a new school. Did you ever hear of it? No. That's my point, right? No, listen, God bless them, and I wish them luck and all the rest of it, and I'm not saying there's not a need for it. But this is a new reality. This was never in Baltimore. You understand? When we were young, it was a TA, the Beis Yaakov, and then there Israel, and that was it. You understand? And maybe a little share, something like that. Now, literally, I think, I'm not mistaken if I say there's a dozen, 2 dozen new ones. Okay? And by the way, girls' schools. And in this period, they added the missing link, which is a seminary. They never had that in Baltimore. Long ago, if you went to Beis Yaakov, if you want to go past high school, you had to go out of town. To New York, to Cleveland, to Israel eventually, and so forth. And now it's all here. Everything I've described has been in the direction of greater insularity. Cultural insularity, of course, right? But also communal insularity. I think the current term they like, I see, is called siloing. It's a silo. I mean, you're keeping your own little, niche. The Baltimore community is heavily siloed, right? The Baltimore community, generally speaking, heavily siloed. Because the Frum had anything to do with the non-Frum and vice versa. It's a new variation now we're living of the classic historic phenomenon of 2 Baltimores that we talked about last week. But when we talked in the past about 2 Baltimores, it was the Germans versus the Russians, right? Now it's not that. It's the Frum versus the non-Frum. They live in different neighborhoods, different subcultures, right? They even got 2 different magazines. One of them caters entirely to the modern, and one caters to the Orthodox. You see? So it's not only one Jewish Times. You see? Now, there are different Jewish values, right? One community responds to Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, and the other community says it's Tikkun Olam. And what the heck is Tikkun Olam? Who created that? You understand? And so each one says to the other, what's that? You understand? So this is what we're looking at. You see, in addition to the crystallization of Orthodox infrastructure that I've been describing tonight, which in itself led to a new religious and sociological community here different from the non-observant community, which in itself led to divisions in how each community lived its lives, the 2 communities, the Frum and not Frum, actually interpreted the cultural challenges of Jewish postmodernism differently and responded to it in opposite ways. One community moved to the right in an act of doubling down. No changes. Adrabah. How many Orthodox rabbis does it take to change the light bulb? We don't change. Okay? It's the old business. In other words, it's not any kind of modification towards greater college. It's no college. You see? It's a doubling down. On the other community reacted by embracing greater and greater change, convinced that was the right way for Judaism to go. I'm talking about conservative Orthodox and Reform. The Orthodox in Baltimore and around the world, to a large extent, moved to the right in 1970 to 2020. Conservative Reform moved to the left in 1970 to 2020, right? It started with female rabbis. It was a big controversy back in the 70s. Well, not in Reform, but in Conservative, which happened in the 80s. My goodness, they had a bloody civil war In the Jewish Theological Seminary, the two guys on the right were the Talmidei Chachamim. This is, what's his name, Saul Lieberman and Weiss Halivni, and they say you can't do it. And this guy waited for him to drop dead on an airplane. I kid you not. And I'm serious. And what do you call it? And then he pushed this guy out, and he pushed it through that the conservative have female rabbis. So this is the first move to the left. I'm going somewhere with this. Right? Next, the Reform adopted patrilineal descent. So we define Jews differently. Even if your mother's not Jewish, but your father is, you're counted as Jewish. That's just a unilateral thing that they said. Then it's performing and officiating at mixed marriages. As Rabbi Jacob said, you can't fight gravity. Now, once upon a time, the Reform movement was against mixed marriages. And many Reform rabbis would not perform mixed marriages, and conservative for sure. But that changed, as we know. As a matter of fact, let's take a look at the gravity. What's the next one? Look at the numbers. That means 3/4. That's pretty bad. 3/4. Right? Those are heavy numbers. You see what I'm saying? Now, wait a second. Next, that's not all. This happened 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, to the left. And then, in Reform and Conservative, LGBTQ, which once upon a time, they were never imagined in Reform and Conservative, but it became the thing in America. Next, I'm not done. Rabbis whose spouses are not Jewish. Can you enroll in Reform seminary to be a rabbi if your wife or husband is not Jewish? And the answer is yes. This is recent, the last 5 years. The test case, by the way, was this lady rabbi, or rabbi-to-be, and she wanted to enroll, and her spouse was not Jewish, and it was a whole big fight back and forth, but in the end they said it's okay. Now the spouse was another lady, okay? So he asked this question to Moshe Feinstein, so I'm going fishing, I'm simply pointing out that, and incidentally, in each case, it's interesting, especially in conservative Judaism, initially they just said, let this be an option. But once it was in, it became the only option. And usually the arguments in favor of this is the Obama argument, which is you got to get on the right side of history, right? Which is not an argument. That's not an argument. Right? Now, I'm not done. Then you have the issue of conversions, right? So basically, I'm getting to the point where the gap has widened in the last 50 years. And so you say these people are Jewish, and I say they're not Jewish, like that. Recent trends in Reform Judaism, anti-Israel, okay? The, Rabbi Amiel Hirsch, in the Stephen Wise Temple, that's the big shul, big Reform, one of the big ones in Manhattan, did a conference last year, Save Reform Judaism, from the Reform rabbis who are attacking Israel. Recover, our sense of Klal Yisrael, as he would call it. Now, the other side says like this, wait a minute, the Reform movement was against Israel originally. You guys hijacked it and made it pro-Israel. So these are battles that are happening within Reform Judaism, okay? So what I'm trying to say is like this, he's the hero within the context of Reform Judaism. He's trying to say, stand with Israel. You understand? And, oh my goodness, the head of I told you I like to watch these things. It's my pornography, And they had this whole big conference last year, and the head of the HUC said, no, don't force any kind of ideological straitjacket on anybody, and so forth. The Reconstructionists is gone. If you Google, you see, they're all anti-Israel. Okay? So let me put it this way. I've just described the logical consequences of non-insularity. Right? It should not be that way. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's become that way. In the last, and when? In the last 50 years. Right? This is something that happens in our lifetime. Now, the result is, I would say, a seemingly unbridgeable gap. It's not like the Orthodox here and the conservative here The Orthodox went here and the Conservative went there. So they're farther away than ever. You see? They're farther away than ever. What's going to happen, for example, I don't know, a Reform rabbi who's not considered Jewish, I guess he said, but I wear a yarmulke and I don't walk the shul on Shabbos. Yeah, but you're not Jewish. Right? Or some kind of gay issue or something like that. The possibilities for discourse have been shredded simply because there's no common ground. On the other hand, there's been a certain spillover into the non-Haredi community over these events. One would be Beth Phyllis Day School, which actually started in the 40s. At the time when TA started to take off, in 42, I think it was, Rabbi Rosenblatt. Now, Beth Phyllis is its own world. It still is. And back in Forest Park, they were loaded also. They made a day school at that time with the idea that it was a very smart idea that there would be a feeder for the synagogue because all the bar mitzvahs and everything would be there, and that's what happened. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. Right? And for a long time, the school was only up to the 8th grade, but they did quite well. As you know, during this past half century, in the 80s, I guess it was, they made a high school, which is a big school today. Right? So they're copying the day school model from the right wing. And who made the high school? Modern Orthodox Jews in this community who were turned off from TA and Beis Yaakov. And then who copied that model? Salman Schechter at the Chizuk Emunah. That's a day school. Now, I'm not sure. I think they had a high school and the high school folded or something like that. I could be wrong. Is that what happened? Yeah. But they're still up to the 8th grade. The point is, once upon a time, conservative Jews, Reform Jews, day school was like treif. You want to go to public school. You want your children to mingle with other types of people. You want them to have different experiences. And to have a day school too parochial, too narrow. But spillover. Of course, one of the factors helping the day schools in Baltimore was the decline in the quality of Baltimore City public schools in the last half century. That's a fact. Right? But on the other hand, the stuff I'm talking about tonight, like the Kollel couple settling here, is really an independent dynamic. But going back to conservative and reform, they flourished here until around 1990. Okay? They were doing well in the 80s. But then the numbers started to slowly but surely decline. A friend of mine, who will remain nameless, was going to Suburban on Saturday morning a couple months ago, and this person told me, he said, they passed by Baltimore Hebrew, the 8s are got better, they want to see what it's like. So he went in for services on Saturday morning in the Baltimore Hebrew. 4 people. Okay? So, now I'm not sure it's not like that all the time, but I'm just saying it's not what it was in 1970. It's not what it was in 1980. Maybe it's virtual. Perhaps. Not everything. Maybe. It could be. I just tell you, if I was standing in a shul and I saw 4 people there, even if they're virtual, you need a new model. But anyway, it's not what it was once upon a time. That's my point. The question was and is, can you make up the loss of those who are abandoning it with new converts and new spouses? The Reform say that non-Jewish spouses can be full members of the synagogue. Because you got to. So today, as you know and I know, we have the anomaly of 2 big Reform temples being in the midst of a right-wing and centrist Orthodox neighborhoods, because what just got built right next to the Baltimore Hebrew congregation? This new and beautiful campus with the Suburban Orthodox. So that's because they have to accommodate more members. So here you're talking about 4 people. Okay, so you just reinforced my point. You understand? You reinforced my point. So you have all these big things, and next door to is the other thing. But is it a question of location? I mean, change of location did not help Har Sinai. Right? They moved all the way out there. It didn't work. So the problem is, how can you have a conversation between this group here and this group over here? How can you have a conversation with representative right-wing Orthodox rabbis? You can always find one or two that are outliers, and they'll participate in all these kind of, communal sorts of things. But people who represent the bulk of the community that I'm talking about, that's risen here since 1970, the rabbis are very isolationist. In Baltimore, certainly since 1970 and even before, there's been no dialogue because things have gone too far. Like I said before, how can I tell you I recognize your Judaism? Besides theology, I don't consider you Jewish. Your mother isn't Jewish, her mother wasn't Jewish, and her mother wasn't Jewish. You just decided to be Jewish. Among other things. Aside from the observance gaps, aside from the theology gaps, the cultural literacy gaps are amazing and increasing all the time, right? In other words, you have huge swaths of the Baltimore Jewish community, hardly any Jewish books in the house, if any. And then you come to, let's say, Park Heights or Green Spring, the kid got for his bar mitzvah present 200 swarm, you see, in another language called Hebrew. And it's not considered anything unusual. Do you understand somewhere else that we consider radical, right? As I always say, there's what you call the Daf Yomi, what's it called? The Siyum HaShas, right? And they put together 100,000 people in Meadowlands, I think it was, and Madison Square Garden. But to many other people in Baltimore, Maryland, Daf Yomi is the name of a Korean chef. You understand? So it's wide. It's sad. Okay, I'm not saying this is a happy thing or a funny thing. It's sad. But this was a pronounced feature of Baltimore Jews and Judaisms in the half century of 1970 to 2020, which is now past us. So what about the next 50 years? 2020 to 2070. As I say, we should live so long. Obviously, who knows? I mean, you got the anti-Semitism rising in ways that we did not anticipate. And so that itself. More immediately, in Baltimore, Maryland, the Jewish community, and all the developments that I've described tonight has always developed on what we call the point of a sword, meaning we're a small little piece of the end of Baltimore City. You understand? The Gemara says if feelings are good, then there's enough room on the point of a sword for a couple to live. If feelings are bad, then even if the bed is 60 miles wide, it's not big enough for the couple. It all depends on whether you have affection for each other, right? How you treat each other. They're very famous. So let's put it this way. You're one bad mayor away. The crime could go out of hand. There could be communal trouble. It could be riots. It could be anything. You don't know, right? You don't know. So, and that's externally. So don't say, Baltimore is here forever and all the rest of it. It could go in a minute. Number two, internally, the tuition and the cost of being from is killing people. Is it sustainable, right? I mean, you see all these high-end advertisements in the magazines. Can you drop $100 every night for dinner? Right? Now, by the way, there are people that can, but they don't include me. You see? We all know the price, even it's for kosher food, for education, for all these other things. I'm not even talking about Pesach hotels, all the rest of it. Is a killer. So what's a family, a regular family, who hasn't made it rich and struck it rich? What are they supposed to do in these kind of situations? Will the model be able to hold? Okay? Will the model be able to hold? What do parents do? I don't know the answer to this question. What do parents do in Baltimore, Maryland today from people who live in this neighborhood if they can't afford it? Can't afford to send their kids to Beit Yaakov, let's say, for example, or TA. I don't know. You have to talk to I know one thing, the school doesn't simply say like this, okay, then we'll let you go anyway. That's the old days. When my parents came to this town. It's not nowadays. And so what do you do? Will there develop non-right-wing schools? It's going to cost a fortune. That's what hurt the Rambam. Will it happen? And if it happens, how non-right-wing will it be? Will it be centrist, like Torah Mada, from YU, pro-Zionist, that's one model. Will it be open orthodoxy, left wing? That's a different model, quite a different model. None of this happened, I can tell you the past, in Baltimore in the past half century. Will it develop here as this community grows and grows? Because if current trends continue, community is going to get bigger. Mirz Hashem, right? Your kids, your grandchildren grow up, they'll get married. Some of them, if not all of them, will end up living here by choice. And then you have more people. And so where's it going? On the other hand, maybe things will go farther to the right. Maybe the Hasidim will take over. It could be. Nobody knows. I have spent 5 lectures scratching the surface of the past. Speculating about the future, whether here or in Yerushalayim, I leave to you, the not-so-silent kibbutzing majority. And with that, we are adjourned, sign and die.